If you go back and look at the very first Captain America comic book, what you're going to see is a picture on the front cover of Captain America being introduced to the world by literally punching Adolf Hitler in the face. The comic book came out in 1941, and this was before even the United States was directly fighting Hitler and the Nazis. But it is interesting to see that even that early in World War II, this was kind of the perception of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, kind of these comic book villain type of guys. And of course, it may seem a bit silly to kind of make this analogy between the Nazi Party and comic book villains, but it's also something that people were obviously already doing as early as 1941, and obviously people were responding to this in the realm of public opinion. And I think it's an interesting idea to play with a little bit. So for example, you can go ahead and pick any comic book villain you want, and there's probably a few exceptions to what we're about to do, but for the most part, any comic book villain. I'll go ahead and pick Two-Face, from the DC universe. And I want you to imagine that Two-Face is now the head of a totalitarian government in some country, whatever country that is. And I want you to compare this to the Nazi Party, okay? Hitler being in charge of a totalitarian government in Germany. Now you, for whatever reason, are forced to jump into some sort of strange machine where it's going to randomly put you either in Two-Face's totalitarian society or Adolf Hitler's totalitarian society. So you don't know how you're going to appear, but when you do, you're going to have to live your life in this totalitarian regime. So it's going to be completely random. You could be, white, Asian, Jewish, black, whatever. You could also be working class, middle class, ruling class. You're not sure. So it's going to be completely randomized, but once you kind of jump into the machine and get transported to wherever you're going, you're going to have to live in that society. I don't know about you, but I 100% would be crossing my fingers and hoping that I end up in the world where Two-Face and his cronies are running a totalitarian society rather than ending up with Hitler and the Nazis. And I think that anybody who has done any sort of investigation into what life was actually like for people, and in particular people who were oppressed under the Nazi regime, would absolutely be agreeing with me 100%. I mean, I don't think anyone would disagree that the Nazi Party and Hitler in particular, their ruthlessness, their disregard for morality, their programs of murder on a mass scale, this makes the average, James Bond or comic book villain look pretty tame by comparison. So people whose job it is to come up with threatening and menacing and violent villains, evil people, they can't even come up with stuff that really even comes close to matching what the Nazis actually did. I think this brings us to the question of just how this was able to happen. So how is it possible that, as we've established, a group of essentially comic book villains was able to legitimately take control of a democratic government and come really close to controlling all of Europe and basically ruling Western civilization? The way I like to think of the Nazi Party coming to power is kind of this metaphor of a shipwreck at sea in the middle of a storm. What factor is most dangerous for the ship? Is it the high winds? Is it the high waves? Is it the rain? Is it the lightning strikes? Is it the hail? Etc. So as you can see, it's kind of tough to pinpoint what exactly it was that made the ship wreck, but there was obviously a variety of factors that kind of all came together and resulted in devastation. Furthermore, why was there a storm in the first place? And why was the ship sailing into the storm to begin with? Rather than isolating just one or two factors that might have led to the rise of the Nazis, I'll make the argument that it was actually a combination of factors, and for the Nazis to rise to power, it really was the perfect storm. This first part of the story gets ignored by a lot of people who do research into the rise of the Nazi Party, but it probably all starts with a guy by the name of Otto von Bismarck. This was a man who was German chancellor, he was a general, he was a diplomat, and he basically ran the show in Germany from about the 1860s all the way up through the 1880s. Bismarck is one of those rare guys in history who acts and behaves exactly how he looks. So if you look at a picture of him, he's got this helmet on and he looks very kind of mean and gruff, and he's got this big thick mustache, and he more or less behaves and believes kind of in the way you would think someone that looks like that would do. So he hated liberalism. He was not a fan of parliaments or kind of democracy, anything like that. He was not a fan of socialism or, different groups being equal. He was a traditionalist, so he was authoritative. He wanted to have essentially monarchy because he believed that was the way things worked, or at least how they worked best. He's often given credit by historians as a person who kind of championed the idea of realpolitik. And this idea of realpolitik kind of refers to how rulers rule. Kind of means the ends justify the means, and you can kind of get power, maintain power, and kind of do whatever it takes to do whatever's best for you as a ruler and your people. But realpolitik for Bismarck also meant being patient, waiting for your opportunity, and then taking advantage of your opportunity for your own purposes whenever possible. So here's Bismarck kind of talking about that. Quote, "A statesman cannot create anything himself. He must wait and listen until he hears the steps of God sounding through events, then leap up and grasp the hem of his garment." End quote. So what you see here is that Bismarck is an opportunist, and he's willing to take advantage of any opportunity that comes his way that's going to benefit Germany. But before you start thinking that he's just a pragmatist who's, kind of looking to maneuver events the best way he can, he's definitely also a militarist. So here he is again, quote, "The great questions of the day are not decided by speeches and majority resolutions. That was the great mistake of 1848 and 1849, but by iron and blood." End quote. So clearly Otto von Bismarck was not afraid to use violence and militarism to get what he wanted. Now, what he was referring to there with 1848 and 1849 is, of course, the revolutions of 1848. And these were a series of revolutions that kind of swept across Europe right around 1848, and most of them failed and were unsuccessful. So a lot of these revolutions were kind of embodiments of this constant struggle between liberals who kind of were trying to champion ideas of the Enlightenment, wherein, people have a little bit more power to, decide their leaders with parliaments and basic social human rights, that type of thing, and conservatives. And the conservatives kind of want to maintain monarchies, the traditional kind of moral order, that type of thing. So Otto von Bismarck comes to power just a decade or so after these 1848 revolutions. And he kind of sees their failure, as he said in that quote, as a result of kind of liberals not being able to rule effectively because you need to be able to use iron and blood to get what you want. One of the things that Bismarck gets credit for doing is he kind of forged what's known as the Second Reich. Okay, so Reich kind of just means empire in German, or at least that's the rough translation. And the first one, of course, was Charlemagne, who was crowned around the year 800, and then all the way up that lasted for 1,000 years, supposedly, until Napoleon crushes it in 1806. Now, this Second Reich would go from the time of Bismarck until the end of World War I, and then, of course, most people know of the Third Reich, which was Hitler and the Nazis. So Bismarck engineers a bunch of wars, a bunch of diplomacy, a bunch of deals with other leaders, and ultimately he's able to take the Prussian kind of state and merge it with some other areas around him, and he's able to finally forge this Second Reich, this German empire. So a lot of people thought that still, after all these years, people were trying to recreate that Roman Empire, become the successor to the Roman Empire, and they put a Kaiser in charge, and Kaiser roughly translates to Caesar. So it is kind of interesting to think about how, even after all these years, the Roman Empire still has a part to play in international politics and diplomacy. But anyway, back to Bismarck. So he plays a very instrumental role in creating this kind of German empire where you now have a Kaiser who's in charge, basically an emperor, but they also put in a parliament. Okay, and this parliament will be known as the Reichstag. Now, parliament had very limited power at this time in Germany, and most of the powers, the ability to kind of police the state and the ability to wage war and do diplomacy, this type of thing, most of the important powers rested with the Kaiser. So Bismarck is finally able to forge this German kind of nationalism, this German people that he wanted to kind of make into one country. He's finally able to do that with the parameters that we already talked about, being the way things will be run. And again, he's able to do this using a variety of different techniques, from diplomacy to wars, in particular the Franco-Prussian War, where the Germans essentially just wiped the floor with France in 1870. And shortly after this, of course, Germany would become its own state, and Bismarck would have a role in running things for a number of years. Now, unfortunately for Bismarck and some of the people and historians who tend to idolize him from time to time, there were some very obvious inherent problems with the Second Reich that he created. We do, of course, have to consider the source here, but listen to Karl Marx, of course, the founder of communism, essentially, talking about the way that Bismarck constructed his empire. Quote, "It is bureaucratically constructed military despotism, dressed up with parliamentary forms." End quote. And Karl Marx has really an excellent point here. So why was Bismarck ultimately an influence on the rise of Nazism? Well, if you think about it, military force was used to create the Reich and keep it going. So Bismarck would tell you himself that he had no need for any other institutions. He didn't like having a parliament. Parliament didn't have that much power. To him, to Bismarck, the military should have been in charge of most things. So right off the bat, you have a precedent set for violence and force being able to be used for political goals. This is now seen as maybe not okay, but this is something that there's now a precedent for. And furthermore, other than the fact that wars and violence were used to kind of create this Reich, during Bismarck's reign and during the Kaiser's reign, martial law, suspension of civil liberties, these types of things were commonplace in many different areas. There were also complaints that the military was doing questionable things in colonial wars, particularly during battle, but even times after battle. It was a common criticism that the German army often acted as conquerors rather than as occupiers. And this was true not only in places like Africa, where colonial wars were going on, but in places like France. Listen to historian Richard J. Evans, who we're going to hear a lot from in this series, talking about this idea. Quote, "In 1904 to 1907, in an act of deliberate genocide, the German army massacred thousands of Herero men, women, and children, and drove many more of them into the desert, where they starved. From a population of some 80,000 before the war, the Hereros declined to a mere 15,000 by 1911 as a result of these actions." End quote. The Herero are a people in West Africa that Germany was kind of in a war with, kind of imperialism and the scramble for Africa at its finest. Germany was trying to take control of colonies to catch up with the Britons and the Frances of the world. That was happening in Africa, so that's the German army in Africa, but the quote goes on to describe how they behaved in France. Quote, "In an occupied part of the German Empire such as Alsace-Lorraine, annexed from France in 1871, The army frequently behaved like conquerors facing a hostile and refractory population. Some of the most flagrant examples of such behavior had given rise in 1913 to a heated debate in the Reichstag, in which the deputies passed a vote of no confidence in the government. This did not, of course, force the government to resign, but it illustrated nonetheless the growing polarization of opinion over the role of the army in German society." End quote. I like this quote from historian Richard Evans because it shows that, yes, the army was behaving out of control in areas of Africa with massacres of indigenous peoples. They were behaving as conquerors rather than occupiers in parts of Europe. And the people back home, the parliament, the Reichstag, saw this, but they couldn't do anything about it. So they passed that vote of no confidence. But with that system that Bismarck set up, where it's kind of more an empire than a republic, there's nothing the parliament can really do about it. Of course, not all members of the German military were behaving in this fashion, but there was this kind of overall sense that certain members and maybe the military as a whole was kind of overstepping its bounds. At least that's the way it seemed to Parliament at the time. Many of these military people would end up retiring and then going into the bureaucracy after their military service. So what becomes interesting is that many members of the German bureaucracy throughout World War I, and even as we get into the Weimar Republic, were former members of the German military. And this kind of idea of militarism and militarism permeating society really does play a factor going forward. And again, it's not just militarism in the sense of the army, but Bismarck was actually using this philosophy to kind of crack down on people that he thought were a threat to the Second Reich. So he cracked down on Catholic Church. This is an example of him kind of crushing civil liberties. He was throwing priests in jail for not cooperating with certain laws that he was kind of putting out there. And what's kind of ironic about this is that many quote-unquote liberals cheered this on. And they thought that the Catholic Church, liberals kind of more secular, more Enlightenment-based, whereas the Catholic Church kind of represents tradition and conservatism. So a lot of liberals cheered this on, Bismarck cracking down on civil liberties, not realizing that soon enough that crackdown would be directed at the liberals themselves. So this idea of tribalism is something we'll get into more later, but this is something we see even in the modern day. People will cheer on some sort of law or some sort of action that hurts their enemy, but the underlying principle of it is that now civil liberties can be violated, and that precedent has been set, so I'm going to cheer it on because it hurts my enemy, but I'm not realizing that it could now be used against me. And of course, in Bismarck's case, that's exactly what happened. They would pass an anti-socialist law that curbed civil liberties for a variety of different people, including liberals, socialists, etc., throwing them in jail, denying them freedom of speech, etc. So the lesson, as always, you need to have some values and principles underlying what you're striving for. You can't just devolve into tribalism and I want what's best for my team and I want to punish your team whenever possible. Because if you do it that way, eventually everybody's going to lose. Ultimately, Otto von Bismarck is a very controversial character. I do understand that he does have a legacy of moderation and diplomacy, and for the most part, I think this is how he's taught in modern day history, and that's kind of how I learned about him at least. But digging into the research a little bit more, it's definitely evident that his ultimate legacy could be much more of dominance and authority. For a lot of historians, this would set the tone for what was to come with the Nazi Party. So we've gone over Otto von Bismarck and kind of the way he set up the new German state and kind of how this and the way things were run kind of contributes to some of the precedents that we'll see much later in Nazi society. The second element we'll look at is anti-Semitism. So anti-Semitism was not something that was widespread in German society during the Second Reich, but it did become, on the fringes of society, a little bit of a factor and something that was often recognized as something that was getting worse throughout Germany during the 1880s, 1890s, and early 1900s. For example, fringe political parties such as the Christian Social Party would often come up with these anti-Semitic platforms, and these parties would kind of pop up from time to time, and occasionally they would gain, one or two parliamentary seats. So we'll go over the parliamentary system of government later, but basically these parties were on the fringes. The vast majority of people were not kind of buying into what they were selling, but what these parties were doing was assembling all of the pieces together that the Nazi Party could kind of pick up and turn into a cohesive force much later on. So Jews had been used as scapegoats in Europe for a long time. You could go back to the Black Death. You could go back to interpretations of Christianity that blame Jews for the death of Jesus Christ. And ultimately, these interpretations would kind of infiltrate politics and culture. So here's a cultural thinker, a popular novelist in the 1890s by the name of Julius Langben, who wrote a book, and in the book, he has these long rants against Jews, and he's talking about them. I'll just let him explain what he thinks of the Jews. Quote, "A poison for us, and will have to be treated as such. The Jews are only a passing plague and a cholera." End quote. Popular novelists would write stuff like this, maybe newspaper editors, people in culture would be facilitating these ideas, and ideologues would often use popular philosophers like Nietzsche and kind of use their stuff to distort and distill it until it becomes really unrecognizable. So Nietzsche's concept of the ideal human being and, people who were kind of anti-Semites would kind of take this idea, run with it, and use it to show how, if you're not the ideal human being, then perhaps you can be, discriminated against or blamed, as is the case for Jews. So eventually, thinkers at the time, if we can call them thinkers, start taking these ideas from different philosophers, maybe distorting an idea here, distorting an idea there, taking some of those ideas from novelists like Julius Langben, and they start linking a popular idea at the time, which is social Darwinism. And the idea of social Darwinism is basically survival of the fittest. And they start linking this idea with anti-Semitism. So now all of a sudden we start seeing how people start believing in superior races and eugenics. And now we're really starting to get a bad kind of murky soup of bad ideas. And this would lead to a strange mix of pseudoscience that will ultimately get us to quote-unquote racial hygiene. So this is an idea that became somewhat popular on the fringes of German society, that people could ultimately be categorized, labeled, and ultimately cleansed. So this would be a very dangerous idea, this kind of linking of pseudoscience with social Darwinism and anti-Semitism, and ultimately this kind of idea of racial hygiene, where we can kind of, just like we can, wash our hands and make ourselves cleaner, we can kind of make the races and kind of make the people in our society a little more cleaner. Obviously, this is a very dangerous idea, and it's something that the Nazis would take advantage of and kind of merge in with their other beliefs to create a really dangerous situation for Jewish people in Germany. Now, it is key to remember that the vast, vast majority of Germans were against this stuff, and there's no really direct link, from anyone saying something during this time in the 1890s, early 1900s to Nazism. There's no direct link just yet, but we also have to recognize that the Nazis didn't just come up with these ideas out of nowhere. They were taking ideas that were on the fringes of society before World War I, and they would kind of mold and meld them into the dangerous and terrifying ideology that they would ultimately come to rule with. And just one last point on this anti-Semitism idea. Yes, the vast majority of Germans were firmly against this idea, but where it gets dangerous is who are the minority that believe this stuff. So what if it is the government and the leaders of your society that believe this stuff? And if you don't think that's possible, here's an example of how that kind of anti-Semitic rhetoric on the fringes of society can work its way all the way up. Here's Kaiser Wilhelm II, right before World War I, talking about how it will be important to, quote, exclude the Jewish influence from the army and the administration, and as far as possible to limit it in all the activities of art and literature, end quote. So here you have the leader of German society openly talking about what he sees as an anti-Jewish situation. So it's important to understand that it wasn't the Nazis who kind of created this ideology. They were building upon stuff that was already kind of built into the German system. If not on a large scale, at least certainly on a small but somewhat influential scale. If we go back to our metaphor of German society kind of being that ship that's sailing along, all of a sudden we have Bismarck and the system that he put into place and this kind of undercurrent of anti-Semitism. These are the things that are starting to kind of make the waves rise and the wind's picking up and the ship is still sailing along, and eventually it's going to hit that storm. And the storm in this case is World War I. World War I breaks out in 1914, and for the next 4 years, it's just obviously a complete train wreck for everybody involved. So the Germans are fighting the British and the French on the Western Front, and that battle is just locked into a huge stalemate where we have trench warfare and barbed wire and machine guns and literally millions of people dying per year. I mean, you're talking millions of casualties in a single battle. And on the Eastern Front, the Germans are actually having a lot more success as far as throwing back the Russians. By the time 1916 rolls around, what we see is a change of leadership. So Hindenburg and Ludendorff are two of the famous generals for Germany that were part of the success on the Eastern Front, and they kind of move towards the Western Front, and they actually kind of move into what many call, quote-unquote, a silent dictatorship. So this results in a more aggressive prosecution of the war. Civilians are treated more poorly in conquered areas, particularly economically. Civil liberties crack down a little bit more aggressive kind of military approach from Ludendorff in particular, and this was going to be the way the rest of the war was run for the Germans, with the Kaiser taking a little bit of a back seat to these two military generals. Germany is able to have enough success on the Eastern Front where the Russian, basically entire society, will completely collapse. You'll get the Russian Revolution of 1917, and this will be big for a lot of reasons, in particular to this kind of slow climb we're making towards that Nazi regime. The Russian Revolution is huge. So really for the rest of World War I and really the rest of the Weimar Republic before the Nazis come to power, there will be this fear of a communist takeover, or even worse, a legitimate communist election. So this fear was palpable. Communism and some of the more liberal parties, including the Social Democrats, who were kind of like the most significant liberal party, they began to get lumped together in a bit of an awkward situation where anyone who was seen as liberal was kind of, you viewed them with a little bit of sketchy eyes because you wonder if they also have some communist leanings, and can you blame them because of the chaos and the turmoil that was going on with the communist takeover in Russia at the time. Ultimately, the Germans would be defeated on the Western Front. There would be numerous breakthroughs by the Allies, help from the United States, including manpower, vehicles, money, ultimately helped turn the tide towards Britain and France, and Germany would be defeated. The next question after this is, who takes the responsibility for the defeat? Now, the Allies kind of lumped all of that responsibility of the war in the first place, all those dead soldiers, all those destroyed towns, civilian damages, all the damage to the environment, the money spent, they're all going to blame that on the Germans, as we'll see. And this is going to lead to incredible bitterness between Germany and the Allied countries. But also inside of Germany, who's going to take the responsibility for this epic defeat? And what we're going to see is that there kind of comes to the forefront this popular myth of the army kind of never losing this war on the battlefield. Rather, it was the civilian politicians who surrendered because of their traitorous ways and lack of courage. The terms of the Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919 to end the war, were pretty terrible for the Germans. So the Germans were forced to pay hefty reparations in the form of money and materials to the Allied countries. They were forced to essentially disband their army. They were no longer allowed to have an army more than 100,000 people. They were not allowed to have an air force, essentially no navy. And furthermore, there was something called Article 231 in the treaty, which became known as the War Guilt Clause. So the Germans were basically forced to, at least the politicians who signed the agreement, essentially forced to admit guilt for World War I, saying that this whole thing was their fault. Again, all of the deaths, all the destruction was their fault. And this creates a huge burning resentment among people in the German middle class, lower class, even politicians who, maybe even rightfully thought World War I was not the fault of one single country. There were lots of, factors that led into the war, and to pin that all on Germany seemed unfair to the Germans at the time. And most historians, even today, think this was not a smart move and it was not a fair move, at least the War Guilt Clause in the Treaty of Versailles. Allied troops were stationed in Germany, particularly western parts, where they were occupying certain important economic areas to make sure that those reparations were getting paid on time and effectively. And they were treating the civilians there relatively poorly, exploiting them economically, things of that nature. And this, of course, is only contributing to this overall feeling of resentment among Germans. Going along with this idea is what we already talked about, where this myth of the Germans never being defeated on the battlefield and the military never being defeated starts gaining steam, and in part it's because of this growing resentment among the German people towards the Treaty of Versailles. So listen to Kaiser Wilhelm II talking about this myth of Germany never losing on the battlefield. Quote, "For 30 years the army was my pride. For it I lived, upon it I labored, and now, after 4.5 brilliant years of war with unprecedented victories, it was forced to collapse by the stab in the back from the dagger of the revolutionist at the very moment when peace was within reach." End quote. So here you have the Kaiser, the leader of Germany, before he gets sacked and removed after World War I, talking about how it wasn't the military's fault. We were just about to win. We got stabbed in the back by essentially social democrat, politicians who threw in the towel just as we were about to win. Okay, of course, the evidence clearly shows that the German military was exhausted, defeated, and done, but this myth gained steam, in particular with the Kaiser talking about it, Ludendorff, the general, propagating it, and even social democrat politicians were kind of jumping on board because this was kind of the nationalist thing to do, and the German people didn't want to hear about how they had lost. The general and kind of de facto military leader of Germany at the time, Ludendorff, actually pulls a fast one towards the end of the war. Once he realizes that things are going to go poorly and they're probably going to lose here, he starts to advocate for the democratization of the political system. So he realizes that if it's the democratic politicians who agree to this peace as opposed to me, then they're the ones that are going to get blamed for the loss. So Ludendorff, the tough guy, avoiding responsibility at the end, not all that surprising. Sadly, and this would have really devastating results for the legitimacy of the new democratic government. And speaking of the new democratic government, it's in a bit of a tough spot here. So the parliamentary system that gets established after the Treaty of Versailles allows for it's a basic parliamentary system. So there's so many seats, and whatever percentage of the seats your party wins, that's essentially who's running the government. This system inherits all the parties that had existed before World War I and during World War I, and the people in Germany were fervently political. I mean, in 1912, 85% of the eligible population to vote voted. So compare that with, the United States today, where, we're lucky if we get 50% of the population out to vote. There's this kind of myth that German society was apolitical, or they didn't care about politics, and that's kind of what led to Hitler. Absolutely not. So this was a society that cared deeply about politics and was incredibly active in the political process. So with this parliamentary system, we start to see the breakdown of the way the parties kind of break down into essentially liberal and conservative lines. So you could have far left communist parties, you could have far right radical nationalist anti-Semite parties, and then you kind of have the Social Democrats, center left, and then some center right parties as well. What's interesting is that each of those offshoot kind of political groups could really have a fair amount of influence, because you can get parliamentary seats and you can gain influence that way. So here's an example of what I'm talking about here. So the reception of veterans who came home from the war varied from place to place, and it varied from party to party, and particularly those radical fringe parties, particularly the radical communist type revolutionary parties, they were very anti-veteran. So listen to one soldier talking about his experience coming home from World War I. Quote, "On November 15th, 1918, I was on the way from the hospital at Bad Nauheim to my garrison at Brandenburg. As I was limping along with the aid of my cane at the Potsdam station in Berlin, a band of uniformed men sporting red armbands stopped me and demanded that I surrender my epaulettes and insignia. I raised my stick in reply, but my rebellion was soon overcome. I was thrown down, and only the intervention of a railroad official saved me from my humiliating position. Hate flamed in me against the November criminals from that moment. As soon as my health improved somewhat, I joined forces with the groups devoted to the overthrow of the rebellion." End quote. So what he's talking about there is these kind of groups that are anti-government. They're probably communists, thugs essentially roaming the streets, beating up veterans, things like that. And this is actually creating a situation where more and more people are now going to right-wing parties who are very much against this sort of treatment of veterans, and kind of perpetrating this idea of the quote-unquote November criminals, who are the liberal politicians who kind of surrendered. Here's another soldier talking about his experience. Quote, "I shall never forget the scene when a comrade without an arm came into the room and threw himself on his bed crying. The red rabble, which had never heard a bullet whistle, had assaulted him and torn off all his insignia and medals. We screamed with rage. For this kind of Germany we had sacrificed our blood and our health, and braved all the torments of hell in a world of enemies for years." End quote. So what we're seeing is that this idea of the criminals who kind of turned the Republic over to foreign powers and kind of betrayed the German people, this myth becomes propagated throughout German society. Really, right after World War I, the kind of language of German politics becomes permeated with metaphors of violence and war and things of this nature. And what really becomes interesting is veteran groups start forming around political parties. So, for example, there was the Steel Helmets for a far right-wing party. Almost 300,000 people were involved in the Steel Helmets. The Social Democrats had a group called the Free Corps. The Communists had a group called the Red Army. And it's almost like imagine a steel cage match where, you throw in all these groups, and, this time the violence is real. What happens is these groups go out on the streets, and they essentially roaming the streets using force to attempt to get what they want. Anyone who's labeled a November criminal, a November traitor, could be attacked, assassinated, intimidated, beat up. Even, large-scale street battles would happen on the streets. Here's historian Richard J. Evans talking about the new politics post-World War I in Germany. Quote, "Far worse, however, was the situation on the streets, where all sides organized armed squads of thugs. Fights and brawls became commonplace, and beatings up and assassinations were widely used. Those who carried out these acts of violence were not only former soldiers, but also included men in their late teens and 20s who had been too young to fight in the war themselves, and for whom civil violence became a way of legitimizing themselves in the face of the powerful myth of the older generation of front soldiers." End quote. I think there's this kind of myth that after World War I, Germany becomes immediately far right, and then they're upset about the Treaty of Versailles, and all of a sudden Hitler strolls in, takes power, and the rest is history. What really happens is, after World War I, Germany did not immediately become far right. It became polarized, and that was the real enemy here. So each side, whether it be the steel helmets for the right, or the Free Corps for the left, or the Red Army for the communists, or any of the other various groups, had their own kind of political sides. The language of political discourse was spewed with violence. You had these small groups running around, beating each other up, street violence. And this polarization and a refusal to compromise really became a huge issue for the stability of the Republic. And just to be clear on what exactly the Republic was, so after the Treaty of Versailles, a parliamentary system of government was established. This was called the Weimar system. There was an executive who was basically a president, very similar to what we would have, who had executive authorities on certain issues, and a parliament based on proportional representation. You receive the amount of seats in parliament based on the proportion of seats that you get in the vote. Now, unfortunately, this favors small parties and fringe groups because you now have a seat at the table, even if you only get a very small percentage of the vote. So compare this with a kind of first past the post system where, we have in the United States. You kind of have to get the most number of votes in whatever election you're in, and then that person wins and everyone else loses. A lot of historians have argued that a parliamentary system facilitates the rise of fringe parties because the way it's set up allows for them to gain a seat at the table where they otherwise wouldn't. After World War I, there's something called the Weimar Coalition that rules the German parliament. So this is mainly the Social Democrats who have the majority of the votes, but it's also the Center Party, who's kind of the party for the right. So they get 76% of the vote to start, and they kind of form a coalition to rule from there. But their essentially rule slowly deteriorates over the course of the 1920s until this coalition only has a percentage in the low 40s by 1930. So that means that essentially enemies of the Republic, by the time 1930 comes around, had very close to a majority of seats. They weren't all united together, but the kind of traditional Weimar Democratic Coalition was receiving a minority of the votes by the time 1930 comes around. The president of the Weimar Republic could rule by decree and essentially establish law and order if he needed to. This was used, it was called Article 48, being able to rule by decree. This was used 136 times by the first president. So not a good precedent to set when you're trying to establish, a parliamentary system to allow the executive to essentially run the show 136 times. In 1925, the first president would die, and then Hindenburg, remember the German general from World War I, is going to get elected. Hindenburg, as we'll talk about later, was ultimately a massive disaster for the Weimar Republic. So he had no faith or care about democracy, and rather than defend these principles, he would eventually hand the reins over to the enemies of the Republic, including the Nazi Party. Hindenburg was kind of a symbol of the old monarchy, the old traditions, and this is probably not the best person to be in charge when you have all of the factors that are destabilizing a democratic system. The executive portion of the government was a mess, as we saw, and as we'll continue to look into Hindenburg later. And the parliamentary part of the system, the legislative part, was a mess as well. So the Social Democrats were the major liberal party, and the Center Party was the main conservative party. The Social Democrats, as we talked about, were getting divisions and issues from the Communist Party, legitimate threats from the Communist Party, as well as splinter groups from the Social Democrat Party. The center was getting issues from far-right parties. For example, the Nationalist Party gained 20% of the vote in 1924, and this group actively wanted a return to the Kaiser. So even the major parties were dealing with issues, and they were trying to get their affairs in order because they couldn't really figure out a way to consolidate everybody because of all the conditions in Germany that were pulling everybody apart and all that polarization that we talked about. You can go ahead and add to this that it kind of seemed like the Weimar Republic never truly had the support of the army or of the bureaucracy. So remember, most of the people who were in the bureaucracy were just holdovers from that Second Reich under Bismarck, and many of them came from the military to begin with. So these people did little to ensure that civil servants were committed to the Republic and, resisting attempts to overthrow it. So there's kind of this interesting thought where you don't want to violate people's civil liberties and kind of force patriotic people into the bureaucracy, people who are only going to follow the party line, et cetera, but you also don't want to have people in the bureaucracy that are actively against, the Republic, or at least apathetic about it, because you're going to need the bureaucracy if you want a stable government. Thus far, we've gone over a lot of the factors that contributed to this big, perfect storm of destruction that would ultimately lead to the Nazis. So we've talked about Otto von Bismarck and the way he set up a system of government in Germany and the way he unified a whole German people, but the way this whole thing was kind of built on sand. We talked about this anti-Semitism slowly bubbling underneath the surface, World War I, the Treaty of Versailles, the Russian Revolution, the Weimar Republic, and the inherent weaknesses and instability and polarization that it faced. And what really is going to be the thing that turns this storm into just something that is really uncontrollable is an absolutely complete economic meltdown in Germany after World War I. To put it quite simply, there was hyperinflation, which basically just means inflation on a massive scale, and it was maybe one of the worst hyperinflations of all time. This resulted from a variety of different factors, but quite simply, government expenditure far exceeded government revenue. So Germany expected to go out and win the war and then use the spoils to foot the bill. So they expected to go out, spend a lot of money on the war, and then, win it and use all the territories and resources they gained to, pay for the bill. And this is exactly, ironically, what the Allies actually did to Germany. This was their plan as well, and this is what they did. So they enforced those reparations, and things go downhill very quickly. Allied countries would seize areas of Germany, occupying them for more resources, force the Germans there to pay the reparations on time. The government was printing money towards the end of World War I anyway, and this economic recipe is going to lead to hyperinflation that is just massive in scale. In 1923, if you wanted to buy $1 in Germany, you had to pay over 17,000 marks for it. In April, that number was 24,000 marks. July, 353,000 marks. August, 4,621,000 marks. September, 98,860,000 marks. October, 25,260,000,000 marks. November, 2,193,600,000,000 marks. And then in December, this number's so high I don't even know how to say it. I'll just say the numbers here. 4,200,000,000,000,000 marks. So whatever that number is, that's how much $1 was worth in Germany in December of 1923. If that doesn't tell you the scale of the hyperinflation, I don't know what was. Here's a French columnist kind of commenting on this situation, quote, We must only hope to God that we don't get into these or even higher numerical values with our everyday currency, merely because of the overcrowding of the lunatic asylums that it would cause." End quote. The numbers and the inflation were getting so ridiculous, the value of money was becoming essentially meaningless. I mean, you can go online and you can look at the pictures of, German kids stacking up huge piles of, German marks, German money, and using it for either toys or you can read about people using the money for firewood, because all of that money was so meaningless, it was actually more useful to fulfill everyday tasks like toys or firewood, whatever the case may be. The printing presses literally couldn't even keep up with the amount of money that was needed to be printed. What's really horrifying and terrible about the situation was that the price of food in particular became really dangerous. I mean, you could go grocery shopping, grab something off the shelf for, say, 5,000 marks, and an hour later when you went to pay for it, or maybe 30 minutes later when you went to pay for it, that same item could now be 8,000 marks. So just in the time it took for you to pick it up off the shelf and pay for it, the inflation was so great that the cost of the product increased. And of course, this is going to lead to riots, looting, gunfights, crime, basically a descent into chaos. There's stories of girls selling themselves for packets of butter, people stealing to survive, and really, you can't blame these people. They're just doing what they have to do to survive. And this is going to absolutely wreak havoc on people's faith in institutions, in particular credit and debit, fairness, equality. Ideas like this are starting to be questioned significantly by average German people. When you add this hyperinflation to the effects that modernization and technology were already having on the economy, it just adds to the problem. So this problem of mechanization in the 1920s, this leads to hundreds of thousands of people losing their jobs. In the coal industry in particular, 100,000 people at least lost their job between 1922 and 1929. Clearly, unemployment was a major issue, not just for the coal industry, but for a variety of industries all throughout Germany. The Weimar Republic was now in a situation where you have just massive inflation, horrible economic conditions, but you also have promised welfare and, you need to deliver to help these people. So unemployment insurance schemes, welfare schemes were trotted out, and the idea was to try and balance out this horrible economic despair, but ultimately the numbers of people who needed that welfare far exceeded what the system was designed to cope for. Enforcing employer contributions to these welfare systems was disliked heavily by businesses. Increasing the tax burden led to resentment among many business leaders towards the Republic, which would have repercussions further down the line. Promises made to veterans, disabled people, unemployed, poor, housing schemes, hospitals were ultimately under-delivered. And again, when you throw in these economic problems and this welfare, it's really a recipe for disaster. Take veterans, for instance. 2.7 million men came back from the war with wounds or disabilities, and for a large part there was a failure to deliver on the promises made earlier in the Republic's life to help these people, and it led to massive discontent. When you look at the state expenditure, kind of the budget for the Weimar Republic, the number one thing the government was spending money on was reparations to the Allies. The number two thing was pensions for veterans. So there was millions of children who ended World War I without any fathers, because again, millions of Germans would die in the war. People were coming home from the war disabled, sick, and they were expecting a pension, expecting veteran benefits, this type of thing. War widows needed benefits, so these pensions were really stacking up, and this welfare system in particular was really dragging down the economy. And the government simply couldn't keep up with this, plus the horrible economy, and they were forced to kind of print money, only fueling the inflation worse and worse. So this is the kind of big picture of the German economy kind of melting down, but I also don't want to lose the kind of everyday experience of this. So I'm going to read a little quote from historian Richard J. Evans, who's talking about a veteran who's coming home from the war, and he's kind of face to face with these economic and these welfare situations. So, quote, born in 1892, Adolf had fought in the 1914-18 war and sustained a serious injury. Not in a heroic battle against the enemy, however, but from a kick in his stomach by a horse. It required no fewer than 6 intestinal operations in the early 1920s. An old industrial accident in a family with 6 children put him into further categories of welfare entitlement, apart from the war injury. Unable to find a job after the war, he devoted himself to campaigning for state support instead. But the local authorities demanded as a condition of continuing his accident benefits after 1921 that he surrender his radio receiver and aerial, since those were banned from the municipal housing in which he lived. When he refused to do this, he was evicted with his family, a move to which he responded with a vigorous campaign of letter writing to the authorities. He acquired a typewriter to make his letters more legible and tried to acquire other kinds of benefits reflecting his situation as a war invalid and a father of a large family. The conflict escalated. In 1924, he was imprisoned for a month and a half for assisting an attempted abortion, presumably because he and his wife thought that in the circumstances, 6 children were enough. And in 1927, he was fined for insulting behavior. In 1930, his benefits were cut and restricted to certain purposes, such as the purchase of clothes, while his housing allowance was paid direct to his landlord. He was charged in 1931 with welfare fraud because he'd been trying to make a little money on the side as a rag and bone man, and again in 1933 for busking. He approached political organizations of the right and of the left in order to get help. An attempt to persuade the authorities that he needed 3 times more food than the average man because his stomach injury left him unable to digest most of what he ate was rebuffed with stony formality. End quote. I really like this quote because it encapsulates all of the factors that would kind of exist for an everyday German in Weimar society. So he's a war veteran. He's dealing with the scars of the war. He's got a family. He no longer has a job because the economy is terrible. Inflation makes it difficult for him to buy food for his family. He gets kicked out of his house because he can't pay the rent. He's looking to the government for support, and support that they promised him, with this idea of a welfare state. And, the government is kind of throwing his hands up saying, we can't support everybody because we just don't have the money to do it. So they kind of have to pick and choose who they can support. And this guy, unfortunately, doesn't get chosen. And, he just is forced to live just a horrible couple of years in this society. So if you don't think that the economic conditions and World War I had an impact on destabilizing German society, just look at this guy. I mean, how stable would you be? How loyal to your government would you be if that's the situation that you went through? What makes the situation even sadder to me is that political parties and political press and different agents from both the left and the right, and the far left and the far right, were taking examples like this guy and using them as a way to make a political point. So they were basically exploiting situations like this for their own political gain. It was said that the political press was completely undermined by what was called boulevard papers. So these boulevard papers were cheap sensationalist tabloids that would go out every night, and they would kind of talk about sensationalist propaganda or, the out of control things that were causing the downfall of the republic, and there'd be a lot of military jargon and violence and focus on that. So if that doesn't sound familiar, maybe it should. Now even the political press was falling victim to this trap of polarization. Again, you had political parties, veteran groups with huge numbers of members, even youth organizations now who were by majority distrustful of political figures and institutions. Many were hostile to the republic itself. You had a courts and justice system where, these trials would play out in the media and they would follow along party lines, and oftentimes political bias and political sensationalism would carry the day. Right-wing outlets were propagating this belief that the Jews were the ones who had done the stabbing in the back. So these were the November criminals who led the Communist Party and permeated the liberal parties of Germany, the ones who agreed to the Treaty of Versailles and who set up the Weimar Republic. And these were the ones who were doing the stabbing in the back. Never mind the fact that there is no evidence whatsoever to back this up, but this would permeate certain areas of German society. So listen to a newspaper reporter observing essentially a riot involving Jewish immigrants in Berlin in 1923. Quote, "Everywhere in the side streets, a howling mob. Looting takes place under cover of darkness. A shoe shop at the corner of Dragoon Street is ransacked. The shards of the window panes are lying around on the street. Suddenly a whistle sounds. In a long human chain covering the entire width of the street, a police cordon advances. 'Clear the street,' an officer cries. 'Go into your houses.' The crowd slowly moves on. Everywhere with the same shouts. 'Beat the Jews to death.' Demagogues have manipulated the starving people for so long that they fall upon the wretched creatures who pursue a miserable goods trade in the Dragoon Street cellar. It is inflamed racial hatred, not hunger, that is driving them to loot. Young lads immediately follow every passerby with a Jewish appearance in order to fall upon him when the moment is right." End quote. So you have all these factors in society contributing to these strange outbursts of violence, and you start having this myth propagated throughout society that Jewish traitors and these November liberal communist criminals are the ones who have led us to this horrible situation with the Weimar Republic. Again, the vast majority did not believe in this myth, but the pieces were now in place, and the storm was now getting worse, and German society was now crumbling apart during the Weimar Republic, and a group of people like the Nazi Party couldn't have asked for a more perfect storm in which to take power with a radical and dangerous agenda. All right, so there you have it. 60 plus minutes on some of the background and the important factors that contributed to a unstable climate prior to the Nazis taking power in Germany. So this is a multi-part series. In the next couple episodes, we'll get more into some of the more concrete events that led up to the Nazis taking power. We'll get into Hitler, Nazi ideology, things of that nature. So more of that to come. As always, if you enjoyed it or if you found something educational about the podcast, go ahead, rate, review, subscribe, tell a friend, do what you have to do to help out the podcast. All of those things are great. It's been great to see and hear some of the feedback from people who are listening that are enjoying it. So that's been really cool again to hear. And I just, want to thank everybody for listening. So until next time.